podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective. Today's episode will be hosted by Dr. Erin Elmore. Listeners may remember Dr. Elmore from her multiple guest appearances on the show, and we're happy to announce that she will now be hosting occasional episodes too. Dr. Graham Taylor will still be the regular host of Behavioral Health Today, but we're excited to bring you multiple perspectives and voices on the show through our guests and now through our hosts.
Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a Triad production. I'm your host, Dr. Erin Elmore, and today I'm joined by Daniel Kim. Dan is a marriage and family therapist from La Mesa, California. He has 12 years of experience working with clients who struggle with trauma, relational problems, addiction, and spiritual issues. He's also worked with members of the clergy who struggle with deep personal issues. And I can't think of anyone more fitting to be here today because we just happen to be talking about the integration of spirituality with therapy. So welcome, Dan. We're glad to have you with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really honored to be here and just to be asked to share my journey. And so I'm really looking forward to today.
Good. Us too. So let's start there. Tell us about your journey. How did you come to appreciate the topic of spirituality as it relates to therapy? Because I feel like that's something that we don't often hear talked about.
I would say that the integration of spirituality and theology with psychotherapy has been a big passion of mine for a long time. And it was something that was nurtured within me when I was in my grad program at Bethel Seminary here in San Diego. And their marriage and family therapy program, it was just a big priority to really integrate our faith with our practice. And ever since even graduating, I feel like my journey has really been through a lot of ups and downs, new experiences, and new directions of where my belief system or my theology has gone, as well as how I integrate faith and practice. And so that's pretty much the gist of it.
Yeah, what I'm getting is it's an area of personal interest for you, but also you have professional training in faith and spirituality and how to integrate that into therapy, which is wonderful. How would you define spirituality? Let's just take a minute and actually define what that is, because I think there's so many different takes on this term. So how do you explain spirituality?
I mean, I'll say that for myself, spirituality is the experience of the transcendent, which is like a greater purpose and meaning beyond my own self-interest and primary senses. And this experience of the transcendent, it flows from a deep connection, like with the greater reality, with oneself and with other people. And so at the core, spirituality to me, it's a connection and it's a relationship, but it's also a disposition that flows from that.
I love that definition. Yeah. So you're saying it's not just a set of rules or principles that somebody follows. It's really the connection between themselves to themselves to other people, and then themselves to the broader world or culture, other people. That's beautiful. Yeah. I've heard it defined where it's kind of like the soul, quote unquote, of a person. So that could be couched within religion. It could be people who have an anti-religion, and that's really their spiritual viewpoint is anti-religious. But essentially it could be defined as like morals, values, beliefs, your worldview. But I like that you're also talking about the relational connection between yourself and fill in the blank. That's beautiful. Well, what do you think are some of the benefits of incorporating spirituality into therapy?
Well, I'll step back a little bit from that question and say that for myself, it's actually unavoidable for me to incorporate spirituality, because I actually don't see spirituality as a component of therapy among all these other components. I actually view therapy as spiritual work. And mind you, I didn't say I view therapy as religious work, but I view it as spiritual work. And I'd be glad to kind of explain that a bit. I mean, it goes back to the question, like how spirituality is different from religion. And like you just said, like there are so many views on the relationship between both. And for myself, what really worked for me and what I really found helpful, so this is just a personal view of mine, is that I have a premise on which I base my differentiation, meaning like this premise is really a contrast between two concepts. One concept is essence, and the other concept is system. And
Okay.
system can mean framework, it can mean structure, but essence and system is how I differentiate both. And to use a biblical analogy that Jesus used in the Gospels, it's wine and wineskin.
Mm,
And basically, in essence, I view that spirituality is the wine and religion is the wineskin. And I liked how you said earlier, Erin, like how spirituality is the soul. You know what I mean?
mhm.
And religion is like the body. And so, how I would also frame it is that spirituality is the experience, while religion is the container of that experience.
Yeah, well stated. That makes a lot of sense.
And what does experience mean? Well, it means the words that I included in my original definition of spirituality for myself. Experience is connection, it's relationship, and it's a disposition that flows from that. Okay. And so that distinction between spirituality and religion is really important to me personally, because it's really useful in kind of discerning how and why people get stuck in their
Hmm.
faith. Okay. How I've seen so many professing people of faith, and even in so many religious leaders throughout most of my entire life, is how we tend to, without meaning to, we tend to conflate spirituality and religion. We tend to make both terms more or less equivalent
Yes.
to
Yeah.
each other, and how faith is understood and practiced. And so, like when people say that I'm looking to go back to church, I'm looking to join a spiritual community, they're not really looking for a religion. They're really looking for a spiritual experience, or they're seeking to nurture their spirituality. And so it's akin to like when I'm buying a bottle of wine, I'm not looking for the wine bottle because of the bottle. I'm looking for it because of the content within the bottle. And so it's really helpful to discern between the two for me, because I could more clearly see, oh, okay, this is why people get disillusioned with religion, why people who attend church all their lives, who even serve in church or who have been in ministry, this is why they they experience times of burnout or just a dryness or kind of feeling lost. It's because even though they were very religious in their practices, in their service, they weren't really experiencing the spiritual.
Yes. Yeah. That makes
Did
sense.
I explain that clearly? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I like that analogy of the wine bottle versus the wine. You're really looking for the substance and that connection, as you were talking about earlier. And I think on the flip side, this definition or viewpoint of spirituality, I think can be very healing, because there are also a lot of people who have been really hurt by religion. And so I
Yes.
like that you're making that distinction between the two. And I imagine that helps in your work where you're not stuck on a particular religion. I imagine it's more about that deeper, wider meaning of spirituality, which I think can be more inviting to somebody who didn't have a good experience and maybe doesn't want to go to church. And on that
Yeah.
note,
Yeah.
do you have any examples of that in your practice? How do you work with somebody who comes in? Because I think it's a common question sometimes clients pose us is, hey, do you have a religion? And if we're different, how are we supposed to work together? How do you address that when the client has a certain religion and you're a different background and they're concerned about that? How would you handle that?
It's interesting. In practice, I've had very few times, if like I could probably count on my hand in the last 12 years, where a client of a different religious faith would need me to explicitly address something about their religious system. And that's what's been interesting for me. What clients are really interested in, regardless of their faith background, is healing. And interesting enough too, like I work with a lot of pastors in therapy. I love pastors because I myself have served in pastoral ministry longer than I've been a therapist, more of a lay pastor. And I'm a son of a pastor, and I've seen how much that they hold with the expectations and the responsibilities that are placed on their shoulders. And so they're supposedly spiritual leaders of their flock. And when they come in to see me to work on their issues, it's interesting how we don't explicitly talk about God that much
Mm-hmm.
at all. It's really about themselves and their needs for healing.
Yeah,
Isn't that
no, that makes
interesting?
sense. It is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Cause I think sometimes people think when they're starting therapy that they want someone who's very similar to them. They don't want their beliefs to be threatened. But it's
Which
true
is
that they're
true.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
In the
But there's
beginning.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I
Yeah.
think that's helpful to discuss. And I think even your framework you laid out earlier could be a way that therapists could explain that when somebody comes in the first couple meetings and they ask those questions, is hey, this
Yeah.
this is how I view it. This is how I would do our work together. I imagine that can be helpful for young budding therapists out there if they want to incorporate this into their work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have ideas or examples of how this can be very challenging work? I mean, we're talking about how great it is, and it's very true. However, I'm sure it's challenging as well. What are some obstacles you've run into?
Mm. Well, when it comes to incorporating spirituality into therapy, I'll say the challenge, it doesn't come from where we would typically think it would come from, which is on the client's end. It actually comes from the therapist that's providing the therapy, in
Interesting.
my
Yeah.
view. Oh, yeah. Because remember when I said about what spirituality is at the core is connection, relationship, and disposition, right? Just speak for myself. It's really my disposition that is, you could say, the biggest potential challenge of showing up for my clients the way that they need me to show up. And it goes back to why I view therapy as spiritual work, because of it largely being based on a very generally accepted belief that we operate by as clinicians, right? And have you know the term unconditional positive regard,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah. When we look at this therapeutic principle of unconditional positive regard, which for our listeners, it's a principle defined by humanistic psychologist Carl Rogers in the
Hmm.
1950s. It's now universally considered one of the core tenets of psychotherapy that's taught in just about every graduate therapy program. It's a fundamental way in which we are to see and address our clients.
Hmm.
And it's based on a certain premise, and this premise is that the client in front of me holds an intrinsic and measurable worth as a human being. And so that belief is actually, in my view, a spiritual belief. It's a
Absolutely.
transcendent belief because it's not something that naturally flows from purely empirical, evolutionary, or naturalistic assumptions, right? Because a very practical way of viewing humanity, and unfortunately is the way of the world, in terms of governments, economies, and corporations, it's to view the worth of a human being based on their utility, their capacities for intelligence, functioning, and productivity, right? And human beings, we're just assets in that worldly point of view, okay? But unconditional positive regard is based on something that transcends that purely materialistic, naturalistic worldview. And I think that's something that we can be proud of, that the way that we provide therapy, how we're supposed to treat clients, is based on a spiritual premise. It's because people have immense intrinsic worth, and we're to treat them that way in therapy. You see what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's that
Yeah.
assumption that somebody has value just for being a human being, regardless of what
Yeah.
struggles they've gone through, regardless of why they're in your office or what their past
Mhm.
says. Absolutely. And yeah,
Exactly.
and that really is a moral assumption, right? So that makes sense. And then that flows into how you're answering that question of like maybe the biggest challenge in incorporating or treating people from the spiritual perspective is the mentality and assumption that therapists hold around this. So it sounds like you're advocating maybe for therapists to do some of their own personal work in this area to become better helping their clients. Would you say that's
Oh,
true?
absolutely. Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. I can't say enough about how important it is to do our own work. I see my therapist weekly because I can identify with my clients and that I'm still a work in progress.
We
I
all are.
have exactly, I have my own baggage that can get in the way of me being able to show up, and being the best therapist that my clients need me to be. And when I'm doing therapy, at least in my heart, what I'm wanting and what I'm hoping for is to let them encounter a sense of worth and a
Mm,
sense of connection with myself, but also with themselves, right? That they
mhm.
otherwise may not have outside of the therapy session, right? And when clients are experiencing a deep sense of connection and a deep sense of worth within themselves, that's spiritual.
Yes, absolutely.
We'll be right back after word from our sponsor.
Most of us spend more time at work than anywhere else doing anything else. So why not spend that time in a job you love? Introducing Triad's Jobs Marketplace, the only job site dedicated specifically to behavioral and mental health professionals. Featuring more than 1,000 open jobs from dozens of behavioral and mental health employers, and searchable by location, professional field, employment type, specialization, and more. Jobs Marketplace helps you find your next career opportunity. Full-time, part-time, or gig time, make the most of your time. To access Jobs Marketplace, register for your free professional account at hellotriad.com/BHT. That's hellotriad.com/BHT, and then click to Jobs Marketplace. If you're already a member of the Triad community, visit app.hellotriad.com/jobs. That's app.hellotriad.com/jobs. Visit us today and take your next career step tomorrow.
What you're saying is reminding me, there's this quote from actually Time Magazine from 2017, and they did a study on this, like how does spirituality, they use the term religion, but I think,
Yeah,
based on in the context of our conversation, we can understand they really mean spirituality and how does that
yeah,
impact people's quality of life. And the
yeah,
quote is, scientists have found again and again that those with a spiritual practice or who follow religious beliefs tend to be happier than those who don't. Study after study has found that religious people tend to be less depressed and less anxious than, they call them non-believers, kind of harsh term, but than non-believers that are able to
yeah,
handle the vicissitudes of life, the
yeah,
ever-changing moments of life than non-believers, end
yeah,
quote. So yeah, I think you're
yeah,
hitting that, right? Where it's like there's a lot of healing and depth of meaning that comes from connection.
yeah. Oh man, that's really good. I like that. And in addition to that, I'll also say, in terms of how therapy is spiritual work, when we, from a Christian worldview, when we look at the Bible, it reminds me of when 2,000 years ago, a religious leader basically went up to Jesus and pretty much asked him, what is the greatest commandment? In essence, what are all the statutes and laws and guidelines in their culture add up to if you just boil it down, to one essence? And Jesus told this man that it's love. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. And so when we're looking at this highest ethic of love, why is that called the greatest commandment? Well, we can actually say, and attachment research in the last 70 plus years will prove this, is that love is our greatest need as
Yeah.
human beings. That's why it's the greatest commandment. And when we are helping people in our sessions experience unconditional positive regard, compassion, love from me as a therapist, and treat them with that worth and dignity. And then, number two, we also help them love themselves. I'm talking about true self compassion and acceptance. If that's not spiritual, I don't know what else is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, you're speaking my language. I did my dissertation on attachment theory, and it's true that, yeah, I mean, you
I
can
didn't know
boil
that.
so many wounds and so much trauma down to an attachment wound, a relational wound, right? Like we're most
Yeah.
hurt by people, but the only way to heal that is a person, is relationship, is connection. And that's what therapy is restoring that connection. And so I think it's just very
Yeah.
hopeful that thankfully neuroplasticity exists and our brain can change and our attachment can change, but we do need
Yeah.
that connection, whether it be with a therapist or partner or a church community or spiritual connection, right?
Oh gosh, Erin, you're
That's what's
not.
healing.
We got to hang out. We got to talk more. I want to interview you now. I'm
Okay,
really
fair enough.
curious.
We'll switch
Yeah.
roles. We'll switch roles next time. But no,
It's really
I
good.
definitely, yeah, I'm picking up what you're putting down. It makes sense. Well, I
Loving it.
like stories. I'm sure our listeners appreciate stories as well. Do you happen to have an example of a client where incorporating spirituality, or really the way you're saying it is doing the work you usually do, which is spiritual, has helped them?
I would say every time I am feeling a connection with a client as he or she is going into their wound with me, and they're going into a very vulnerable place, and I'm just a helper, but it's really helping them get in touch with the core center within themselves that is able to heal their wounded parts.
Mm-hmm.
That is a spiritual experience, and that happens every week for me. Honestly, it is so humbling to witness that. And I tell my clients this, I just, afterwards I always tell them how honored I feel to have witnessed this and to see how much they're unburdened and see how parts of their psyche are now feeling set free from burdens that they've been carrying for decades. It is really sacred. That's the word.
Yes.
It is so sacred. It is so connecting, and there's no doubt for me that God is in that process.
Yes.
In that space.
Hey, is there a particular model that you find is helpful when doing this work with clients?
Yes, I work through the internal family systems model of therapy, or IFS.
Okay.
It's a trauma-informed, evidence-based approach that is actually a very spiritual approach because it's based on a really powerful premise, a spiritual premise, really, that without this premise, this therapy would not work. Basically, it's that within every client, and I found this to be true 100% of the time when I witness clients healing, within every human being, there is this core center. And just for simplicity, it's called self, capital S, self. And the strange thing about this core or center of every human being is that it's been unblemished by any traumatic, negative, painful event that we've gone through. And everyone is born with it, and it's able to be accessed within every human being, okay, which is beautiful.
I feel
And
calm just
it's-
listening to that idea. That sounds really nice.
Yeah. And what we're helping clients do in therapy is allow their parts of their psyche, okay, different parts of themselves, to be connected with self.
Mm.
And it's self that does the healing. It's self that does the unburdening. It's not really me. I'm just a helper, maybe a guide sometimes, But it's an amazing premise because, again, it's not something that you can just say, hey, yeah, we found this. This concept of self is purely through evolutionary naturalistic, processes. There's something about self that transcends, that materialistic evolutionary way of thinking. By the way, I want to make a qualifier. I have no problem with, scientific evolutionary thinking. Okay. I'm just saying it's not solely something that you can derive from that alone.
Yes. Okay. That
know what
makes
I mean?
sense. That's really interesting. Is there a
Yeah.
way maybe within that model or that framework that you assess spirituality of a new client, or perhaps introduce the concept of spirituality to a new client? I'm thinking mostly for our early career therapists who are listeners. How can they incorporate this into their work and assess for where the client's at with their spirituality?
It's interesting. There's really no need to explicitly assess for their spirituality because it's implicit. It's
Mhm.
assumed, and that's what I mean by spirituality not being a component therapy is spiritual work. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So
Um,
from your model, it's more of just taking in the client's experience and looking out for how that would translate to a spiritual perspective.
or just a spiritual experience,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
when we are not able to have transcendent experience, and or I'm not able to connect with God or the divine or the universe. I'm not able to feel deeply connected with other people or even myself, right? That means that there's a constraint there. There's a block,
Yeah.
and there
Yeah.
are good reasons for these blocks. And it's on us just to be welcoming of these blocks, to befriend parts of themselves that are, for instance, acting out in destructive ways, making them do bad things, thinking in ways that are just harmful. We come to these parts of the client's psyche with compassion,
Mm-hmm.
and grace. What do I say to my clients often is, the very thing that they're trying to achieve at the end of our work, which is, for all practical purposes, it's an increased capacity for love and connectedness, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
With themselves, with other people, or even with God. Well, that's the end, but the means is the same thing as the ends. Love or compassion, unconditional positive regard, grace, all that is also the means to reaching that end.
Yeah. It sounds, well, correct
Yeah.
me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like as you're listening to your clients' stories, particularly new clients where you're sort of doing an intake, you're really honing in and paying attention to the areas where they have been wounded, hurt, where they're feeling stuck in the sense of not connecting either to themselves, to other people, or to the broader society. Is that accurate?
Yeah, or to God,
Yeah.
nature, the universe. And it's just about helping them. When clients are doing therapy, it is spiritual work because they're increasing their capacity for experiencing the transcendent.
Absolutely. Yeah, there is something very sacred about coming into a therapy space. After the pandemic, a few of my clients had mentioned that too, where although the screen is very convenient, they said there's something different. Like I feel calmer the second I come into this room. And I feel like that's kind of echoing that idea of it's sacred space, it's sacred ground, because you're
Yeah.
talking about very holy, vulnerable, important topics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, specific story. And this is a common story when I work with pastors. Did I say I love pastors?
You did.
I love pastors because it's like, especially in evangelical, like conservative Christian culture that is from my background, it's like they're required to be almost like supermen. They can't have issues. They're not allowed to struggle. They are supposed to have all the answers, and they're supposed to have the greatest connection with God out of everyone in the congregation. And who do they go to? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's hard for them to find. They're human beings too. And it's a common thing for pastors or people in ministry to come in and basically bare themselves and say, yeah, I don't experience the things that I'm preaching.
Right.
There's a divide between what I'm preaching, what I know in my head that I teach, but my heart is like, feels so far away from God, or my heart feels like God is disappointed in me, or he's judging me, he's rejecting me, And there's this divide between their head and their heart. And so, in our, you could say, spiritual work of therapy, it's just about that. Yeah, let's get curious. What are these parts of you that are telling you these messages? What are these parts of you that are making you do bad things, like blowing up at your children, or giving into sexual addictions, or your depression, or whatever, right? And we just invite all these different sides with an accepting stance. I'm just kind of putting my hands out like this, and it's beautiful. But yeah, once we are able to slowly remove these constraints, it's interesting how the head and the heart start to become a little bit closely aligned.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's spiritual work.
It is,
You know?
absolutely is. Yeah,
Yeah.
and how wonderful that you particularly can specialize in helping pastors because it's so ironic, right? It's like the people that we look to lead us to have an experience with God are not allowed to be vulnerable. And true experience, spiritual experience comes from being very vulnerable and very real. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh gosh. Man, I should have included myself in all this too, That's my story. And it's still my continuing story, and it's based on the theological saying that, what's the longest distance in the world to travel between the head and the heart.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
I count myself among that. And this is why I need to do my work, because I definitely can relate to, I'm teaching and I'm, preaching and conveying all these things, but this is not my inner experience.
Right, right. On that note, I've been wondering, do you have any tips for people who are listening to this and thinking, okay, this isn't something I've really given much thought to, but I'm curious, I'm
Yeah.
interested. What are some practical steps that people can take to start fostering the head and the heart connection in their real life?
First step is just to be honest
Oh, that's a tough one.
about
With yourself,
to,
honest with yourself?
to themselves. Yeah.
Yeah.
Honest to themselves.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a part of me that is scared of God, terrified of God. By the way, that's me, Erin. Okay.
Yeah.
There's and there's a part, and this part of my heart, he's this little guy. I can feel him. He's about, early elementary age, but being able to say, this part of my heart is really feeling and experiencing some really unwanted or undesirable things
Yeah.
that a good spiritual person, or a good Christian or religious person shouldn't feel, because that's bad, and that's the first step that I could think of is like, no, just bear it out, for someone who believes in a loving, benevolent God already knows.
Yeah. Yeah.
He already, God already knows those things are already there, and God is already waiting for us to encounter the divine right there.
Yeah. I am sure the biggest question coming to people's minds is, well, what if I don't believe God is a good God? Like, how do you know that he has your best interests at heart? You seem to have this wonderful, beautiful, which I happen to agree with, image of God as wanting us to have good things and loves us, right? But
Oh, I
what
love
about the
that
person
question.
who struggles with the goodness? Because I think that's why it's so hard to approach spirituality sometimes is when we're afraid or don't believe that higher power has our best interest.
Yeah. Well, that certainly was the case for this part of me, and still is to a degree, but he is doing better. I would just be curious, we don't
Mhm.
push back. Therapy is not about correcting someone's religious belief, because therapy is not religion. Again,
Absolutely.
it's spirituality, and it's approaching from my heart in a spirit of curiosity. And actually, I'll say I've encountered this much more in pastoral counseling,
Okay.
because I've done a lot of pastoral counseling as well. It's interesting how, without exception, 100% of the time, I can trace back a negative experience or perception of God back to an early life experience with a primary caregiver,
I love that you're
a
saying
parent.
that because back to the attachment thing. Yeah,
There you
one of my
go.
colleagues did her dissertation on attachment from a parenting perspective to the spiritual. And the
Mm,
data came back that by far, most of the time, statistically speaking, our image of God goes back to our parents and our experience of our parents. So I love that
yeah,
you're saying, look, just be honest. Start by just being honest with where you're at, non-judgmental. Don't need to be scared of it and start
yeah,
exploring, well, why is that? And why do I think that? And how can I
yeah.
get more in touch with, in this case, probably your younger self, but also the people around you and find that connection.
And it's also interesting that when clients find healing from these unresolved wounds of I'm not good enough, or I'm bad, I'm unlovable, there's something wrong with me, these negative core beliefs from these early attachment wounds, when clients are healed from them, it's interesting how their views and experience of God
Shift.
is yeah, it shifts as well.
Yep,
It's
I've
really
noticed that.
interesting.
Yep, because everything's connected. That's the theme here. Everything's connected. Well, Dan,
Exactly.
I feel like you and I could talk about this for 3 more hours, but unfortunately,
Yeah.
we do have to wrap up. It was fun, yeah. Do you have any resources that you want to leave our listeners with? I've thought of a couple while we're talking.
Yeah, it's interesting because I found a text from my grad school days really helpful. And this is more for like professionals or therapists.
Okay.
And it's a big book called A Spiritual Strategy for Counseling and Psychotherapy. And it's by P. Scott Richards and Alan Bergen.
Okay.
So Richards and Bergen. Last edition was the second one in 2005. But I found this a very helpful reference. And for the general readers, it's called How God Changes Your Brain.
Okay.
And the little text is breakthrough findings from a leading neuroscientist, Andrew Newberg and Mark Robert Waldman. And How God Changes Your Brain really goes into the neuroscience of spirituality and religious faith.
Very interesting.
And so, yeah, those would be the two things that I would recommend for the listeners.
Okay, that's great. Well, thankfully, I have different books, so we did not overlap. But I was thinking, I work with kids and teens a lot, and there's a book called Building Moral Intelligence by Michelle Borba, Borba. And that's a really helpful book for parents, I think, because the way I'm thinking of it is spirituality kind of narrowed down into building character, building moral principles for your children. So that's kind of practical and helpful. And then for the therapists and grad students who are listening, there's a book called Soul Searching by Dr. William Doherty, Doherty. Basically, his whole premise is it's not only important to talk about spirituality in therapy, but it is our obligation. Like we must, kind of like what you're saying, that it's part of the process. It is the process. You cannot separate it out. And it's a little esoteric, but it's very interesting and thought-provoking. So those two came to mind as well. What if somebody wants to learn more about you and your practice? Where can they find?
They could find me on Psychology Today. Yeah, just scroll up Daniel Kim in San Diego, and they could contact me. And if they just want to have a chat and not even look into therapy, I love to meet people and just talk to them. And that would be the best way. Yeah.
That's kind. Well, I really appreciate you coming on today. This has been very interesting, and thanks for sharing all of your insights.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'll say, in closing, I have so much to learn. The more I am doing this integrating, my views are continual development. But I'm honored and flattered that I was asked to share my story and my journey. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, thank you to our listeners. We really appreciate you guys being here with us today too. And we'll look forward to having you back with us next time on Behavioral Health Today.
We appreciate all the support from our community. And if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Tribe Network, all rights reserved.